another issue, which is perhaps the most sensitive of all, and the hardest for us to internalize, but we're going to have to start thinking about it if we haven't already, is the issue of demography. I believe that in the 1920s and 30s, when at least the Israeli brand of Zionism, which cuts across all political parties, became the fore, and Aliyah became the ultimate Zionist imperative, and there was all this sort of self-righteous drivel about if you're not a real Jew, a real self-actualized Jew unless you live in Eretz Yisrael. I think that there was real tactical considerations going on that made sense. In other words, you had a world then where there was a whole lot of competition for the Jews of Eastern Europe's hearts and minds. I mean, you had the communists who offered, a better world. You had Bundists and all their culture. You had the American dream, and then you had Eretz Yisrael with its malaria, with violent Arab gangs, with low life expectancy, with basically an entire nation impoverished, huge unemployment. It's very hard to compete with those other kind of ideologies. And so what you did was say, but hey, we're the only real ones. And so there was this sense of self-righteousness, and it carried on at the recent future. I don't think that makes sense anymore. I think that we need to rethink, as Israelis and as Zionists, the role of Aliyah. In other words, I very much believe, as somebody who has taken advantage of the right of return, that we need to keep our gates open to every Jew from around the world who wants to live in Israel, and help them to come over and welcome them with open arms. Because I personally, at least for me, think it's a higher quality of life. But having spent time and seen how people live in Australia and the Jewish communities around the world, I think it's time that we recognize that there are other legitimate, creative, wonderful communities and expressions of Judaism around the world. Embrace that diversity, recognize its strength, and go in the direction of a Achad Ha'am, sort of hub of the wheel vision, where Israel provides spiritual subsistence, destinations for birthright trips, a great reservoir of Hebrew teachers, but it doesn't necessarily have to enjoy this status as the only legitimate form of Jewish living. I don't think it makes sense, and ecologically, can't do it anymore. In other words, Israel right now is pretty crowded, and when we talk about, we just look at population, what we call population momentum. Right now, there's over 10 million people between the Jordan River and the sea. When there's 20 million people, what's going to be? I know whenever I raise these issues in Zionist circles, I get a lot of discomfort and people squidge. And once I had over the chairman of the Jewish National Fund, his wife was giving me a hard time. So I said, well, let me tell you a story. I know all the stories about Winston Churchill and Lady Astor. This was these legendary clash between these, she was conservative, he was labor, and they always, he'd meet her at a party, and she'd say, Sir Winston, you're drunk, and he was the Lady Astor, you're ugly, only tomorrow I'm going to be sober. There was a whole litany of jokes. There's a joke about, it was apparently real anecdotes that actually happened, where Winston Churchill was at a dinner party with her, and he said, Lady Astor, would you sleep with me for £1 million sterling? And she said, Sir Winston, that's a horrible proposition, but for that much money I might suffer such a horrible indignity. He said, well, how about £5? He said, Sir Winston, I'm insulted. He said, Madam, we've already established the principle. Now we're just negotiating over the price. So using that anecdote, I said, can you imagine 80 million people living between the Jordan River and the sea? And she said, no, that'd be unbearable. I said, okay, so now let's start arguing about the price. What is the carrying capacity? Because as Zionists, the notion that the land of Israel has a carrying capacity was anathema, because it was so disingenuously abused by the British to stop Jewish immigration during those terrible years pre and during the Holocaust. And so nobody wanted to talk about it. But biology says very clearly that there is something called carrying capacity, and if you don't believe it, go down to the Gulf of Eilat and see what happens when thousands of people start messing around with your coral and diving in there. You just have to recognize that the earth can produce so much food, the water can sustain whatever it is, and psychologically, it may not be a great thing to be in a country where there's 30 or 40 million people all on the same Alon highway, all trying to get up in Jerusalem, etc. So we have to start thinking about this as a Zionist community to redefine what I would be a more mature, and I think it's happening anyway, the whole notion of Partnership 2000. I'm not exactly sure what this long-time vision or the new defined relationship between the Jewish world and Israel is. I think it's almost like today's a good day to talk about the Supreme Court, because I understand Justice Stevens' last day, but that famous Supreme Court decision about defining pornography, I don't know how to define it, but I know when I see it. So I know when I see it, when I go on these bike rides, and it's Israelis, and it's and Americans, and we're all biking together, we share an interest in love, and it works. He said, this is it. This is where it's going to be. And I think we see it in expressions like the Green Zionist Alliance, which has brought the kind of sort of more progressive American chutzpah on environmental issues and pushing the Israeli colleagues. It's wonderful. It's a wonderful contribution. There's lots of different ways we see that. Certainly in religious pluralism, the engine of pushing us in that direction, and it's coming more and more, and thank God it's still not enough, we don't hear your voices enough, is coming from the world Jewish community. I think that kind of a balance is going to be part of the ultimate new equilibrium, which I believe will be a more sustainable one. Well, I've talked a while and hopefully been sufficiently, how should I put it, controversial or provocative to elicit some sort of discussion on that. I think that'll be the more interesting thing. I just would want to wrap up like this, that Israel has serious environmental problems. I haven't even begun to start telling you about the morbidity, mortality from air pollution that we suffer, and our pitiful recycling rate, which is just as low as America's, which is really embarrassing when you compare it to Europe, where they're 80%, we're not even at 20 yet. I could talk about pesticide abuse, but I think my major point is this, that Israel's environmental problems are serious. We have very acute challenges, so much so that the environment really can't be a spectator sport. We need engagement and involvement, and the fact that all of you would come out here to the American Zionist Organization and listen and think about Israel's environment, the fact that the Zionist Congress could spend 4 resolutions and start talking about that as talking about this sort of partnership. And I want to thank you all for doing what you can do so that you can be not spectators but players in this great challenge for the Jewish people. Thank you very much.